Welcome to the unique tutorial video for the CG03 roll motor replacement. The first step in determining what the root cause of the problem is to hook up your camera to the camera tool and use the GUI. Open up the GUI, power on the CG03, and select the right COM port, then select Open Port. In this case, the gimbal needed to be updated to the current version to work with this GUI. You could see the link was not established and we were not seeing any frames coming back from the gimbal. Close the port, then close the gimbal calibration GUI and open the gimbal bootloader. This is version 1.7. Select the gimbal firmware and choose the right COM port. Select Download. The bootloader will upload the firmware to the CG03 and you'll see a progress bar. Once finished, close the bootloader and open up the calibration GUI. Make sure you choose the right COM port and then select Open Port. You will notice on the right panel will start producing information about the gimbal. You will also notice that under the FS under the COM port will start to give you a number. You may not see any errors when you first connect the gimbal to the GUI. Proceed to start the calibration process, first by holding the gimbal straight and level and selecting Pre-Front Cali. Once done, select Phase Cali. In this case, we notice that the camera started to give an error tone. We also noticed that the right panel gave us a roll motor error message. Now that we know the problem we are looking for, we can close the port and remove the camera. Start the repair process by removing the rubber dampers from the top plate. Remove the main board cover by removing the two screws under the bottom plate. You'll need to yaw the camera to the left or to the right to access the screws. To remove the gimbal cover after the screws have been removed, simply pry up where the screws have mounted and set the gimbal cover aside. Next, remove the 4 screws that hold down the main board to the bottom plate. The order in which we label our main boards are yaw, roll, and pitch. Yaw spins the camera left or right. Roll keeps the horizon level, and pitch allows the camera to move up and down. Looking at the controller board, the motors are hooked up to the bottom of the board are in the same order. Yaw, roll, and finally pitch. The problem was with the roll motor, so we'll unplug that connector. Examine the connector and the wires around the plug to make sure there's nothing frayed or damaged. Next, we need to remove the CG03 badges by using a hobby knife and setting them aside to use later. Remove the rear gimbal arm cover by removing the 2 screws at the bottom near the roll motor encoder. You'll also notice 2 screws next to the bottom plate. To remove the rear cover, separate the 2 sides at the top and slide the cover away from the arm. Remove the roll encoder, being careful not to damage the wires, as they are thin and fragile. You can now see the roll motor inside the rear gimbal arm. Check the rest of the wire by tracing it from the roll motor to the main controller board, checking for frays or damage to the wire along the way. Using a pair of tweezers, guide the roll motor wire through the frame until you get to the roll motor. Next, remove the small gimbal arm cover by removing the 2 screws next to the roll motor. Remove the remaining screws next to that small cover. We'll now need to remove the badges from the left and right side of the camera. Using the same method as we did previously with a hobby knife. After removing the badges, you'll notice 2 screws underneath. Remove these 2 screws and then remove the side covers. On the right side of the gimbal, you'll need to remove the pitch encoder, and then remove the 4 screws holding the pitch motor to the frame. Remove the cover on the other side in the same fashion. Next, remove the 4 screws holding the camera to the gimbal frame. This is the bearing supported side. Now, gently pull the camera ball forward, being careful not to pull too far out, as this will rip the wires connected to the internal electronics. You can now move the camera up or down to reach the roll motor mounting screws. Remove the 3 screws using a number 0 Phillips head screwdriver. Slide the camera cage straight out, making sure to save the screws to reinstall later. Next, remove the 4 screws on the back side holding the motor to the rear arm. Slide the motor out of the front and grab a new roll motor. First, slide the connector and the wire into the rear arm and run the wire up the arm to the gimbal control board. A pair of tweezers will help in this process. Plug the connector back into the controller board. The connector will go only in one way, so do not force the connection. It will lock into place if placed correctly. Now install the 3 motor screws onto the gimbal cage, moving the camera carefully out of the way. This process requires you to line up the holes as best as possible before seating the motor. Now install the motor into the rear arm, making sure the wires are coming out of the motor or facing up and towards the gimbal control board. Once again, line up the holes and install the 4 screws that you removed earlier. Install the roll encoder back onto the rear arm using 2 small Phillips screws. Now we can install the camera back onto the gimbal cage. Make sure you're not pinching any wires when doing this process. You'll also want to make sure the pitch motor mount and mounting support on the other side are slid into the proper position. Install the 4 screws on each side, securing the camera to the camera cage. Shorter screws go on the bearing side, where the longer screws go onto the motor side. You will also want to make sure that you're using machine screws and not the plastic coarse thread screws. Remount the pitch encoder using the 2 screws you removed earlier. Next, mount the gimbal control board to its mounting plate using 4 screws. Temporarily install the controller board cover and install the 4 rubber dampers. We will now test our repairs before we put the cover pieces back onto the gimbal arms. Open the GUI and grab your camera testing steady grip. Hook up the programming cable and the power cable and install the camera onto the steady grip. Power on the camera and open up the port, making sure to have the proper COM port selected. Hold the camera straight forward and level, and then select Pre-Front Cali. Then let the camera go. Next, select Phase Cali. The camera will start moving and adjusting the phase calibration. In this instance, you can see the camera cannot make it to the full deflection. You could help the camera along by grabbing the camera and helping it move to the location it is trying to reach. Looking straight at the camera, it is usually to the right, full roll and yaw. After helping the camera should complete the phase calibration process. After completed, select Excel Cali. During this process, you do not want to touch the camera or shake the table, as this process is sensitive to vibrations and movements. You will notice the camera start to move to the extremes. This process will take about 2 minutes to complete. You'll also notice the gimbal board will be flashing through red, green, and blue during this process. When finished, the light will stop cycling colors to becoming a solid green. You'll also notice the camera will self-center and level when completed. If your camera is not centered properly, you can adjust the center by selecting Front Cali and move the camera to perfectly centered and hold it there for a few seconds. Once satisfied, remove the camera from the steady grip and install the cover pieces. Install the side cover without the hole onto the bearing support side. Next, install the small bottom cover. And finally, the rear arm cover, installing all the screws you removed earlier. To finish up, make sure you install the 2 screws holding the gimbal board cover and install the badges. The unique sticker goes on the back, making sure to line up the sticker properly level with the ground or 90 degrees off the rear arm. Next, install the side stickers in the same fashion, making sure to line up with the gimbal cage. After installing the stickers, hold the camera as if it were on the quad itself, and make sure that all the stickers and the camera looks good. This completes the roll motor replacement.